The most dangerous man in a prison is usually the one nobody notices. The transport bus rolled through the final security gate just after sunrise, its tires crunching over gravel as it entered Blackstone Correctional Facility. Most of the inmates on board stared through the reinforced windows with the same mixture of tension and uncertainty. One man did not. Marcus Reed sat quietly near the back of the bus, his hands resting calmly in his lap. At 62 years old, he was older than most of the men around him. His dark skin showed the lines of age and experience. His short gray hair was neatly trimmed. While others shifted nervously in their seats, Marcus simply watched the facility come into view. The massive concrete buildings, the guard towers, the steel fencing, and the long rows of razor wire did not seem to affect him. When the bus stopped, correctional officers began directing inmates outside. The line moved slowly toward intake processing. Marcus stepped forward without complaint, carrying the small property bag issued to him during transport. Around him, voices echoed through the receiving area. Officers gave instructions. Doors opened and closed. Chains rattled against concrete floors. Yet Marcus appeared focused on every detail without looking overwhelmed by any of it. Officer Daniel Mercer noticed him immediately. Mercer had worked at Blackstone for nearly 20 years. Tall, broad-shouldered, and known for his sharp tongue, he enjoyed reminding new inmates who held authority inside the prison. As the incoming prisoners formed a line, his eyes landed on Marcus. The older man looked completely different from the others. Too calm, too comfortable. Mercer walked over with a smirk. "You look lost, old man," he said loudly enough for nearby officers and inmates to hear. Several people glanced in their direction. Marcus met his gaze politely. "No, sir," he replied. "I know where I am." A few inmates exchanged curious looks. Mercer laughed. "That confidence will disappear soon enough." Marcus simply nodded. He did not argue. He did not react. His calm response somehow irritated Mercer more than an angry one would have. The processing continued. Fingerprints were taken. Identification photos were captured. Personal belongings were cataloged. Throughout the entire procedure, Marcus remained composed. Other inmates complained about delays. Some muttered under their breath. Marcus followed instructions and said very little. Hours later, the new arrivals were escorted toward their assigned housing units. As they crossed the main yard, Mercer walked alongside the group. He glanced toward Marcus again. "You know what usually happens to old guys in here?" he asked. The question carried an obvious intention. Several inmates listened carefully. Marcus looked out across the yard before answering. "People decide who they are before getting to know them." The answer drew a few raised eyebrows. Mercer shook his head and laughed. "You think you are smarter than everybody else?" Marcus smiled faintly. "No, sir. I think assumptions are usually expensive." For a moment, Mercer did not know how to respond. The old man never sounded defensive, never sounded afraid. Every answer arrived calmly, as if he had already seen situations like this many times before. Once inside C Block, Marcus was assigned a small cell. His cellmate had not arrived yet. He placed his property bag on the lower bunk and spent several seconds studying the room. The observation was subtle but thorough. He seemed to notice every corner, every vent, every shadow, every sound. Then he sat quietly on the edge of the bed. Outside the cell, life continued normally. Inmates moved through the corridor. Voices echoed from distant tiers. Somewhere down the hall, a television played. Marcus remained still, listening, watching, learning. Later that evening, Mercer completed a routine walkthrough of the housing unit. As he passed Marcus's cell, he found the older inmate sitting exactly where he had left him. Calm, relaxed, unbothered. Mercer frowned. Most new arrivals looked exhausted after their first day. Some looked frightened. Marcus looked prepared. The guard continued walking, but a strange thought followed him down the corridor. Who was this man? And why did he seem completely unaffected by a place that unsettled almost everyone else? The next morning began long before sunrise. The housing unit remained quiet except for the distant sounds of doors opening and officers changing shifts. Most inmates stayed asleep. Marcus Reed did not. He sat upright on the edge of his bunk, already dressed, already awake, already observing the world around him. His new cellmate, a younger inmate named Eric Dawson, opened one eye and frowned. "You always get up this early?" Marcus smiled. "Most days." Eric glanced at the clock mounted outside the cell. "It is not even 5 in the morning." Marcus nodded. The day still arrives. Eric shook his head and pulled the blanket over himself. Later, when breakfast began, Marcus moved through the chow hall with the same calm demeanor he had shown since arriving. He carried his tray to an empty table and quietly ate while studying the room. He noticed which groups sat together. He noticed which inmates watched everyone else. He noticed which correctional officers paid attention and which did not. Most importantly, he noticed the patterns. Across the room, Officer Daniel Mercer stood near the entrance drinking coffee and watching the inmates enter. His eyes eventually settled on Marcus. The older man sat alone, never appearing nervous, never appearing confused. Mercer found it irritating. Most newcomers spent their first few days trying to fit in. Marcus looked as though he had already accepted everything around him. During the morning work assignments, Marcus received a temporary cleaning detail in one of the administrative corridors. The assignment was simple: sweep floors, empty trash containers, wipe down surfaces. Other inmates treated the task as punishment. Marcus approached it with the same focus he seemed to apply to everything else. A maintenance supervisor passing through the hallway noticed immediately. "You have done work like this before?" he asked. Marcus smiled faintly. "Everybody cleans something eventually." The supervisor laughed and continued walking. A few minutes later, Mercer appeared in the corridor. He leaned against a doorway and watched Marcus work. "You know," Mercer said, "most new inmates spend their first week complaining." Marcus continued sweeping. "Complaining rarely improves a situation." Mercer smirked. "You always have an answer." Marcus looked up politely. "Only when someone asks a question." The response earned a few chuckles from nearby staff members. Mercer forced a smile, but his frustration deepened. Every conversation seemed to end the same way. Marcus never argued, never reacted emotionally, never gave Mercer the response he wanted. As the day continued, other inmates began noticing the same thing. During recreation period, Marcus walked the perimeter of the yard alone. Several men attempted small talk. Others tested him with casual remarks. Marcus answered politely and kept walking. Not once did he appear intimidated or eager to impress anyone. Eric eventually caught up beside him. "Everybody keeps talking about you," he said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That sounds unfortunate." Eric laughed. "People are trying to figure you out." Marcus glanced toward the guard tower overlooking the yard. "Most people spend too much time trying to figure out others." "Then what should they do?" Eric asked. Marcus smiled. "Figure out themselves first." The answer stayed with Eric long after the conversation ended. By evening, stories about the quiet new inmate had already begun spreading through C Block. Some thought he had been a teacher. Others guessed he had worked in law enforcement. A few believed he had military experience. Nobody knew the truth. Yet everyone agreed on one thing: Marcus Reed did not behave like an ordinary new arrival. That night, Officer Mercer completed another housing unit inspection. As he passed Marcus's cell, he stopped briefly. The older man sat at the small metal desk reading a worn paperback book from the prison library. Completely relaxed. Completely focused. Mercer stared for a moment before moving on. Something about Marcus continued bothering him. It was not confidence. Mercer had seen confident inmates before. It was something else. Something deeper. The old man never seemed to be reacting to the prison. Instead, it felt as though he was quietly studying it. And for reasons Mercer could not explain, that realization made him increasingly uneasy. By the end of his first week at Blackstone, Marcus Reed had become a quiet mystery. Nobody could explain exactly why. He did not seek attention. He did not tell stories about himself. He did not try to impress anyone. Yet more people seemed to notice him with each passing day. The reason was simple. Marcus paid attention to things most people overlooked. Early one morning, Eric Dawson sat across from him in the chow hall. "How do you always know what is about to happen?" Eric asked. Marcus looked up from his tray. "What do you mean?" Eric leaned forward. "Yesterday you knew they were going to close the recreation yard before the announcement. The day before that, you knew the kitchen line would be delayed." Marcus smiled slightly. "Patterns." Eric frowned. "Patterns." Marcus nodded. "People show you what they are going to do if you pay attention long enough." Before Eric could respond, a correctional officer entered the cafeteria and announced a temporary delay in morning movement because of a maintenance issue. Eric stared at Marcus. The older man simply continued eating breakfast. Later that morning, Marcus reported to his cleaning assignment. While working in one of the administrative hallways, he quietly observed staff moving through the building. He noticed schedules, routines, Habits. Most people never looked closely enough to recognize such details. Marcus always did. At one point, a maintenance employee pushed a cart loaded with supplies through the corridor. Without warning, a stack of folders near the edge shifted slightly. Before anything happened, Marcus stepped forward and steadied them. The employee blinked. "I did not even see that." Marcus shrugged. "It looked unstable." The employee thanked him and continued on his way. The interaction lasted only seconds, but a nearby staff member noticed. Throughout the afternoon, small moments like that continued appearing. Marcus always seemed aware of his surroundings. He noticed loose equipment before others did. He noticed schedule changes before announcements were made. He noticed which inmates were having difficult days and which officers seemed distracted. None of it looked extraordinary. Yet together, the observations formed a pattern of their own. Officer Daniel Mercer noticed it too. During afternoon recreation, he stood near the yard entrance watching inmates circulate around the track. Marcus walked alone along the perimeter as usual. Mercer decided to approach him again. "You planning to walk that fence all day?" he asked. Marcus glanced toward him. "Just getting some exercise." Mercer smirked. "You always this serious?" Marcus looked toward the guard tower before answering. "I enjoy paying attention." Mercer folded his arms. "Paying attention to what?" Marcus smiled. "Everything." The answer irritated Mercer more than he cared to admit. The old man never sounded defensive, never sounded afraid. Every response arrived calmly, as though nothing inside Blackstone could surprise him. As recreation period ended, another strange thing happened. The inmates were preparing to return to their housing units when Marcus suddenly paused near the entrance gate. He stepped aside and waited. A few seconds later, a maintenance vehicle crossed directly through the area where he had been walking. Several inmates looked confused. Nobody had heard it coming. Marcus had. Eric caught up beside him. "How did you know that thing was coming?" Marcus pointed toward the pavement. The vibration changed. Eric stared at him. "You felt that?" Marcus nodded. Sometimes your ears are not the first thing listening. The comment stayed with Eric long after they returned inside. By evening, stories about Marcus spread through C Block again. Nothing dramatic. Nothing unbelievable. Just dozens of small observations that made less and less sense the more people discussed them. Meanwhile, Mercer completed another routine inspection of the housing unit. As he passed Marcus's cell, he stopped briefly. The older inmate sat reading beneath the overhead light. Calm as always. Focused as always. Mercer watched him for several seconds before moving on. A question had begun forming in the back of his mind. It was a question he did not like. What kind of man spent his entire first week in prison studying every detail around him, as if he had been trained to do exactly that? The second week at Blackstone introduced a new figure into Marcus Reed's routine. His name was Thomas Walker, a 68-year-old inmate who spent most of his days in the library or helping others complete educational courses. Unlike many inmates, Thomas rarely involved himself in rumors. Yet, even he had begun hearing stories about the quiet newcomer. One afternoon, during recreation, Thomas noticed Marcus walking the perimeter of the yard. There was nothing unusual about the walk itself. What caught his attention was the posture, the awareness, the way Marcus seemed to observe every entrance, every corner, and every movement without appearing distracted. Thomas had seen that behavior before. Many years ago, the memory lingered as he approached. "Mind if I walk with you?" Thomas asked. Marcus smiled politely. "Not at all." The two men began circling the track together. For several minutes, they spoke about ordinary things. Books, weather, family. Neither man discussed prison. Eventually, Thomas glanced toward Marcus. "You ever serve?" The question arrived casually, but Marcus understood exactly what he meant. He looked ahead at the fence line before answering. "A long time ago." Thomas nodded slowly. "I thought so." Marcus glanced toward him. "What gave it away?" Thomas laughed softly. "Everything." The answer seemed to amuse Marcus. Thomas continued. "The way you move. The way you watch people. The way you notice things before everyone else." Marcus remained silent. Thomas studied him carefully. "Army." Marcus smiled faintly. "Something like that." Before Thomas could ask another question, a loud announcement echoed across the yard. Recreation would end 10 minutes early due to a maintenance issue. Around them, inmates reacted with frustration. Some complained immediately. Marcus did not. He simply adjusted his pace and continued walking. Thomas noticed something else. Marcus had already begun moving toward the housing unit before the announcement finished. "You knew." Thomas said quietly. Marcus looked at him. Knew what? That they were ending recreation. Marcus shrugged. The maintenance crew was moving equipment 15 minutes ago. The officers changed positions. The signs were there. Thomas stared for a moment. Then he laughed. You really do notice everything. Across the yard, Officer Daniel Mercer watched the conversation from near the gate. He could not hear the words being exchanged, but he noticed Thomas Walker speaking with Marcus for nearly half an hour. That alone was unusual. Thomas rarely spent extended time with anyone. Mercer found himself paying closer attention. Later that evening, during movement between housing units, a minor maintenance problem temporarily disrupted one of the corridors. Nothing serious. Several officers directed inmates toward an alternate route. As confusion spread through the hallway, Marcus calmly stepped aside and waited. Within seconds, the crowd shifted exactly as he appeared to expect. Eric Dawson, walking nearby, shook his head. How do you always know where people are going? Marcus smiled. Most crowds move the same way. Eric laughed. You make everything sound simple. Marcus looked down the corridor. Simple does not always mean easy. That night, Thomas sat alone in the library thinking about their conversation. The more he replayed it, the stronger his suspicion became. He had met military veterans before. Many of them carried themselves differently. Marcus reminded him of something even more specific. Not just military. Elite military. The thought sounded ridiculous, yet he could not dismiss it. Meanwhile, Mercer completed another inspection round through C Block. As he passed Marcus's cell, he noticed the older inmate sitting at his desk with a notebook borrowed from the library. Marcus appeared to be writing observations about books he had read. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. Yet Mercer felt the same uncomfortable sensation he had experienced since Marcus arrived. The old man never seemed lost, never seemed uncertain, never seemed overwhelmed. It was almost as if Blackstone was not teaching Marcus anything new. Instead, Marcus was quietly evaluating Blackstone. And somewhere inside the prison that night, one inmate had begun asking a question that would soon spread far beyond the library. Exactly what kind of military background could create a man like Marcus Reed? By the middle of his second week at Blackstone, Marcus Reed had become the subject of more conversations than any new inmate in recent memory. The strange part was that he had done almost nothing to encourage it. He did not tell stories. He did not seek friendships. He did not try to earn respect. Yet people kept talking about him. Every day seemed to produce another small mystery. Officer Daniel Mercer disliked that more than he wanted to admit. He had spent years understanding how people behaved inside prison walls. New inmates usually followed predictable patterns. Some tried to appear tough. Others tried to disappear. Marcus did neither. The older man simply observed everything around him, and somehow that made him impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Mercer stood near the administration building reviewing paperwork when he noticed Marcus working nearby on his cleaning assignment. The task was simple. Sweep debris from a service corridor and organize maintenance supplies. Most inmates rushed through the job. Marcus moved with calm efficiency. Every tool was returned to the proper location. Every task seemed completed in the correct order without anyone needing to explain it. Mercer watched from a distance. After several minutes, he approached. You act like you have done this place 100 times before, he said. Marcus looked up. Every building has routines. Mercer folded his arms. This prison is not every building. Marcus nodded politely. That is true. The answer annoyed Mercer because it offered no opening for an argument. As usual, Marcus remained calm. Later that day, a sudden equipment problem disrupted movement between two sections of the facility. Nothing dangerous. A maintenance gate failed to open on schedule, forcing staff to redirect traffic. Several officers began discussing alternative routes. Marcus happened to be sweeping nearby. Without looking directly at the group, he quietly moved his cart away from one corridor and positioned it beside another. Less than 2 minutes later, officers redirected everyone through the exact path Marcus had chosen. One maintenance worker noticed immediately. How did you know? He asked. Marcus smiled. The officers were already standing where they needed to be. The worker blinked. You figured that out just by looking? Marcus shrugged. Most people reveal their plans before they speak. The comments spread through the maintenance department before the end of the shift. Meanwhile, Thomas Walker continued thinking about their earlier conversation. The more he observed Marcus, the stronger his suspicions became. During recreation, Thomas sat beneath a shaded table watching inmates move around the yard. Marcus walked the perimeter as usual. His pace never changed. His attention never drifted. At one point, a loud noise echoed from a distant work area. Most inmates immediately turned toward it. Marcus glanced once, assessed the situation, and continued walking. That reaction stayed with Thomas. It reminded him of people who had spent years in high-pressure environments where panic served no purpose. Later, Thomas joined Marcus near the track. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Marcus smiled. "You usually do." Thomas laughed. "Fair enough. What is the first thing you notice when you enter a room?" Marcus considered the question. "Entrances, exits, people, patterns." Thomas nodded slowly. "Exactly." Marcus glanced toward him. "Exactly what?" Thomas shook his head. "Nothing." Yet inside, his certainty continued growing. That evening, Eric Dawson returned to the cell after dinner carrying fresh rumors. "Now people think you were some kind of military instructor," he said. Marcus looked up from his book. "People have active imaginations." Eric sat on the bunk and laughed. "You are not helping." Marcus returned to reading. Across the housing unit, Mercer completed another inspection round. As he passed Marcus's cell, he noticed the older man reading under the dim light again. Calm, focused, unbothered. Mercer continued walking, but the question that had been bothering him since day one returned stronger than ever. Why did this inmate seem more prepared for every situation than the staff responsible for managing them? And perhaps more importantly, what kind of past could teach a man to see so much while revealing so little? The following week brought the first event that people at Blackstone would talk about for months. It started on an ordinary afternoon. The recreation yard was crowded. Some inmates walked laps. Others sat beneath shaded areas escaping the heat. Staff members monitored activity from their usual positions. Nothing appeared unusual. Marcus Reed was completing another slow walk around the perimeter when he noticed something most people ignored. Near one of the maintenance structures, several workers were preparing equipment for a scheduled repair project. A portable generator had been moved into position earlier that morning. Throughout the day, crews had entered and exited the area. Most inmates never paid attention. Marcus had noticed every movement. As he continued walking, he glanced toward the maintenance zone again. Something had changed. A worker appeared confused. Another pointed toward a control panel. Within seconds, two staff members began moving more quickly than before. Marcus stopped walking. Across the yard, Officer Daniel Mercer noticed the pause. He followed Marcus's line of sight, but saw nothing remarkable. Recreation continued normally. Conversations continued. Yet Marcus remained still. Eric Dawson, who had been sitting nearby, noticed. "What is it?" he asked. Marcus did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the maintenance area. "Something is not following the plan," he said quietly. Eric frowned. "What plan?" Before Marcus could respond, a loud mechanical alarm sounded from the maintenance structure. The noise echoed across the yard. Several inmates stood up. Others looked around in confusion. Staff members immediately began directing people away from the area. The situation was not dangerous, but it created uncertainty. Some inmates moved in one direction while others hesitated, unsure where to go. For a few moments, nobody seemed certain which route would remain open. Marcus calmly looked around the yard. He studied the positions of the officers, the movement of maintenance personnel, and the temporary barriers being placed near the work zone. Then he quietly turned toward Eric. "Use the east walkway," he said. "They will redirect everyone there." Eric blinked. "How do you know?" Marcus pointed toward a distant gate. "Because 3 officers are already moving to support it." Less than a minute later, an announcement came over the loudspeaker. Inmates were instructed to exit using the east walkway. Eric stared at Marcus in disbelief. Nearby inmates exchanged confused looks. Several had witnessed the prediction. Meanwhile, staff members worked efficiently to resolve the issue. Throughout the process, Marcus remained calm. He helped guide a few older inmates toward the correct path when they seemed uncertain about the instructions. He never gave orders. He never tried to take control. He simply observed and acted with quiet confidence. The entire disruption lasted less than 20 minutes. Once the maintenance problem was resolved, normal operations resumed. Yet conversations about Marcus spread through the facility before dinner. Some people focused on how he had predicted the redirection route. Others talked about his ability to remain calm while everyone else was confused. Thomas Walker listened carefully to the stories. Each new detail strengthened his growing suspicion. Later that evening, he found Marcus reading in the library. "You saw it before anyone else again," Thomas said. Marcus looked up from his book. "Saw what?" Thomas laughed softly. "You know exactly what." Marcus closed the book and smiled. "People reveal a lot when they are under pressure." Thomas studied him for a moment. "You spent years training for that, did you not?" Marcus's expression remained calm. "Training helps. Experience helps more." Across the facility, Officer Mercer reviewed reports related to the maintenance incident. Nothing unusual appeared in the paperwork. Yet one detail continued bothering him. Multiple people had mentioned Marcus Reed. Not because he caused problems. Not because he sought attention. Quite the opposite. The older inmate seemed capable of understanding situations before anyone explained them. Mercer leaned back in his chair and stared at the report. For the first time since Marcus arrived, a possibility entered his mind. Maybe the old man was not simply observant. Maybe he had spent a lifetime preparing for situations that required exactly that kind of awareness. But if that was true, what had Marcus Reed done before coming to Blackstone that made him so different from everyone else? The days following the maintenance incident changed something inside Blackstone. People no longer viewed Marcus Reed as simply a quiet older inmate. Curiosity had replaced indifference. Everywhere he went, someone seemed to be watching. Some hoped to learn his secret. Others simply wanted to understand why he always appeared one step ahead of everyone else. Marcus, however, behaved exactly as he always had. He woke before sunrise. He completed his assignments without complaint. He read books from the library and spent time walking the recreation yard. If he noticed the growing attention, he never mentioned it. Officer Daniel Mercer noticed it too, and it bothered him more each day. The stories about Marcus were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. What irritated Mercer most was that none of them involved rule violations or misconduct. Marcus was earning attention simply by being himself. One afternoon, Mercer decided he had heard enough. During a routine inspection of a storage area near the administrative offices, he noticed Marcus working nearby. The older inmate was organizing cleaning supplies with the same methodical precision he brought to every task. Mercer walked over. "You seem to have a talent for making people talk about you," he said. Marcus glanced up calmly. "I was not aware people were talking about me." Mercer laughed. "That is exactly the problem. You act like you do not notice any of it." Marcus returned a bottle to a shelf before answering. "People are free to talk." The response immediately frustrated Mercer. "You always have an answer." Marcus smiled faintly. "You always have a question." A nearby maintenance worker struggled not to laugh. Mercer forced a smile and walked away, but the exchange stayed with him. Later that week, something unexpected happened in the prison library. Thomas Walker was helping organize donated books when he discovered an old collection of magazines and community newsletters that had been stored in a forgotten cabinet for years. Most of the material was outdated and unremarkable. Thomas almost ignored it entirely. Then a photograph slipped from between 2 pages of an old veterans publication. He picked it up absent-mindedly. The image appeared decades old. Several military personnel stood together outdoors. The quality was poor, and most faces were difficult to identify. Thomas would have set it aside immediately if one figure had not caught his attention. His heart skipped slightly. The resemblance was not perfect. The photograph was old. The man looked much younger. Yet something about the posture seemed familiar. The stance, the expression, the calm confidence. Thomas stared at the image longer than he intended. Could it be Marcus? The possibility seemed unlikely. Thousands of military veterans existed across the country. Yet the resemblance refused to leave his mind. That evening, Thomas brought the photograph back to his cell and examined it again under better lighting. The image revealed little detail, but one thing stood out clearly. Every person in the photograph appeared highly disciplined, professional, focused. Thomas remembered every strange observation he had made since Marcus arrived. The awareness, the composure, the ability to predict situations before they unfolded. Suddenly the pieces felt connected. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in the library reading quietly, unaware that Thomas had discovered the photograph. Eric Dawson joined him at the table. "You know the rumors are getting crazy now," Eric said. Marcus looked up from his book. "That sounds unfortunate." Eric laughed. "Some people think you were military. Others think you worked for the government." Marcus smiled. "People enjoy mysteries." Eric leaned back in his chair. Are any of them right? Marcus closed the book slowly. Everyone has a past, Eric. Before Eric could ask another question, Marcus stood and returned the book to its shelf. Across the room, Thomas entered carrying the photograph hidden inside a folder. He looked toward Marcus and felt the same question growing stronger than ever. If the man in that picture really was Marcus Reed, then the quiet inmate sitting in front of him was hiding a story far bigger than anyone inside Blackstone had imagined. Thomas Walker spent the next 2 days thinking about the photograph. The more he studied it, the less he could ignore the similarities. The man standing near the center of the image carried himself exactly the way Marcus Reed carried himself now. Not just the posture, not just the expression. It was something deeper, a level of awareness that seemed impossible to fake. Thomas had met many veterans during his life. Most carried memories. A few carried discipline. Marcus seemed to carry both. One afternoon, Thomas sat alone in the library examining the faded photograph again. The publication itself offered few clues. The date had partially faded. Several names listed beneath the image were difficult to read. Yet one word remained visible. Training. Thomas stared at it for several seconds. Across the room, Marcus sat reading a history book near the window. Sunlight reflected softly across the pages. He appeared completely unaware of the attention surrounding him. Eventually, Thomas walked over and took a seat across from him. Marcus looked up and smiled. Good afternoon. Thomas nodded. Can I ask you something unusual? Marcus closed the book carefully. You can ask. Thomas hesitated. Have you ever regretted keeping your past to yourself? Marcus considered the question longer than expected. Finally, he answered. Sometimes silence protects other people more than yourself. The answer caught Thomas off guard. It sounded less like philosophy and more like experience. Before he could continue, the afternoon movement announcement echoed through the building. Inmates began gathering their belongings and preparing to leave. Marcus stood, returned his book to the shelf, and walked toward the exit. Thomas watched him go. The conversation had raised even more questions than it answered. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Mercer had developed a growing obsession of his own. Every report mentioning Marcus seemed positive. Every staff member who interacted with him described the same qualities. Respectful, observant, disciplined, reliable. Mercer wanted to find something different. Some flaw, some weakness, some explanation that would make Marcus seem ordinary. Yet nothing appeared. Later that week, another unusual moment occurred during recreation. A group of inmates had gathered near one side of the yard discussing sports and military history. One man mentioned a famous training exercise used by special operations units. Most of the conversation consisted of guesses and exaggerated stories. Marcus happened to be walking past when he overheard part of it. One inmate noticed him. Hey Marcus, he called. You ever hear about that stuff? Several men laughed. Marcus paused briefly. A little. Then tell us if any of it is true. Marcus smiled. Most stories become bigger every time they are told. The group laughed. One inmate pressed further. Come on. You must know something. Marcus thought for a moment. The people who do the hardest jobs rarely spend much time talking about them. The conversation ended there, but Thomas had been listening from nearby. The answer sounded authentic. Too authentic. It felt like the kind of response someone would give after living that reality. That evening, Thomas returned to the library storage room, hoping to learn more about the photograph. After nearly an hour of searching through old materials, he finally discovered another page from the same publication. Most of the text was damaged, but one paragraph remained readable. It described an advanced military training program attended by highly selected personnel. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. He looked back at the photograph, then back at the article, then back at the photograph again. For the first time, a possibility formed clearly in his mind. What if Marcus had not simply served in the military? What if he had belonged to one of the most elite groups in the entire armed forces? Across the facility, Marcus sat quietly in his cell reading beneath the evening light, while Eric Dawson slept on the upper bunk. Everything appeared normal, yet unknown to Marcus. The scattered clues he had left behind throughout his life were beginning to connect. And somewhere inside Blackstone Correctional Facility, one inmate had started asking a question that would soon change the way everyone saw Marcus Reed. Could the quiet old man actually be far more than a former soldier? Thomas Walker could not let the mystery go. For nearly a week, he searched through every old publication, archived newsletter, and donated Veterans magazine he could find inside the prison library. Most of the material led nowhere. Pages were missing. Names were incomplete. Dates had faded with time. Yet each small clue seemed to point in the same direction. Whatever Marcus Reed had done before arriving at Blackstone, it had not been ordinary. One rainy afternoon, Thomas received an unexpected break. While organizing another stack of old materials, he discovered a military association bulletin from nearly 25 years earlier. The publication focused on veterans' events and community recognition ceremonies. Most readers would have ignored it immediately. Thomas almost did. Then he noticed a familiar surname. Reed. His pulse quickened. He carefully opened the page. The article was short. Part of it had been damaged. Several paragraphs were unreadable. Yet one section remained intact. It described a decorated veteran being recognized for years of service and leadership. The accompanying photograph was grainy, but the face was unmistakable. Younger, stronger, wearing civilian clothing, yet unquestionably Marcus Reed. Thomas stared at the image in disbelief. For several moments, he simply sat there. The discovery answered one question, but created many more. Why had Marcus never mentioned any of it? Why hide such an accomplished past? And perhaps most importantly, what kind of military service had earned that level of recognition? Later that evening, Thomas approached Marcus in the library. The older man sat at his usual table reading quietly. Thomas carried the folded bulletin inside a notebook. He sat down across from him. Marcus looked up and smiled politely. "You look like someone carrying a secret." Thomas laughed nervously. "Maybe I am." Marcus closed his book. "Then it must be important." Thomas hesitated. Then he slid the bulletin across the table. Marcus glanced down. For the first time since arriving at Blackstone, his expression changed slightly. Not fear. Not concern. Recognition. He studied the photograph for a few seconds before looking back at Thomas. "Where did you find this?" Thomas pointed toward the storage room. "Library archives." Marcus nodded slowly. "I forgot that publication existed." Thomas leaned forward. "So it is you." Marcus looked at the photograph again. "A younger version." Thomas smiled. "That answers one question." "Which question?" Marcus asked. "Whether you were military." Marcus remained quiet for a moment. Finally, he nodded once. "Yes." Thomas expected more, but none came. "That is all you are going to say?" Marcus smiled faintly. "Usually." The response left Thomas both amused and frustrated. Before he could continue, Marcus carefully folded the bulletin and returned it. "You should keep looking," he said. Thomas blinked. "Looking for what?" Marcus opened his book again. "The whole story." The answer stayed with Thomas long after he left the library. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Mercer was dealing with his own growing frustration. The reports about Marcus continued. Staff members respected him. Inmates trusted him. Even employees who rarely complimented prisoners spoke positively about the older man. Mercer found himself checking Marcus's file more often than necessary. Yet the official records revealed almost nothing beyond basic information. No explanation. No obvious reason for the unusual attention surrounding him. A few days later, Thomas returned to the archives with renewed determination. If Marcus had encouraged him to keep looking, then perhaps there was more to find. Hours passed before another clue finally appeared. This time it was not a photograph. It was a reference. A brief mention buried inside an article discussing military training programs. Several names appeared on a recognition list. One of them was Marcus Reed. Thomas read the paragraph twice. Then a third time. The article did not explain everything, but one phrase stood out clearly enough to make his heart race. It referenced a highly selective military unit known throughout the armed forces for extraordinary standards. Thomas sat back slowly. The pieces were finally beginning to connect. Across Blackstone, Marcus continued his routine as though nothing had changed. Yet unknown to him, the search for his past had entered a new phase. Thomas was no longer asking whether Marcus had military experience. Now he was asking something far bigger. Exactly how elite had Marcus Reed really been before he ever stepped inside Blackstone Correctional Facility? The discovery changed everything for Thomas Walker. For weeks, he had been collecting fragments, small clues that refused to fit together until now. The article he found did not provide a complete biography, but it confirmed something important. Marcus Reed had not served in an ordinary military role. The recognition list placed him among individuals who had completed some of the most demanding training programs in the country. Thomas sat alone in the library staring at the page long after evening count had begun. He read the paragraph repeatedly, almost expecting the words to change. They did not. The evidence was real. Yet one question remained unanswered. Why had Marcus hidden it for so long? The following afternoon, Thomas found Marcus walking his usual route around the recreation yard. The older inmate moved with the same steady pace he had maintained since arriving at Blackstone. Nothing about his appearance suggested an extraordinary past. He looked like a quiet man enjoying fresh air. Thomas caught up beside him. "I found another piece," he said. Marcus glanced toward him. "Did you?" Thomas nodded. "You knew I would." Marcus smiled faintly. "You are persistent." Thomas laughed. "I think you wanted me to keep searching." Marcus considered that for a moment. "Maybe I wanted you to find your own answers." They continued walking. Thomas removed a folded note from his pocket containing details copied from the article. This training program was not ordinary. Marcus remained silent. Most people never get close to something like that. Still no response. Finally, Thomas looked directly at him. "Who were you, Marcus?" For the first time, the older man stopped walking. He looked across the yard toward the distant fence line. Several seconds passed before he answered. "The same person I am now." Thomas shook his head. "That is not what I mean." Marcus smiled gently. "It is the only answer that matters." The conversation ended there, but Thomas felt strangely satisfied. Marcus had not denied anything. If anything, his silence confirmed even more. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Mercer had begun noticing changes throughout the facility. Staff members mentioned Marcus more frequently. Inmates sought his advice. Even minor disagreements often seemed to calm down after Marcus spoke a few words. None of this made sense to Mercer. The old man held no authority, no special position, no obvious influence. Yet people listened to him. One evening, Mercer stopped outside Marcus's cell during inspection rounds. Marcus sat at his desk writing notes in a small notebook. "What are you always writing?" Mercer asked. Marcus looked up. "Thoughts. About prison?" Mercer asked. Marcus smiled. "About life." Mercer folded his arms. "You really think you have everything figured out, do you?" Marcus closed the notebook carefully. "No, I just spend time paying attention." The answer lingered with Mercer long after he walked away. Later that week, Thomas uncovered one final detail while reviewing archived materials. This time the information was impossible to misunderstand. A reference connected Marcus Reed directly to a highly respected special operations community. The article contained no dramatic stories and no classified information. It simply listed names of veterans recognized for extraordinary service. Marcus's name appeared among them. Thomas stared at the page in disbelief. His suspicion had become certainty. The quiet inmate reading books in the library was not merely a former soldier. He belonged to a level of military service most people only heard about in documentaries and history books. That evening, Thomas sat alone in his cell thinking about everything he had learned. Across Blackstone, Marcus followed his usual routine, completely unaware of the conversations about to begin. The mystery was no longer whether he had served. The mystery was how someone with a background that remarkable could enter prison, endure constant judgment, and never once feel the need to tell anyone who he really was. And as word of the discovery slowly began spreading beyond the library walls, Blackstone Correctional Facility found itself approaching a revelation that would soon leave inmates, staff, and Officer Daniel Mercer questioning everything they thought they knew about Marcus Reed. The revelation arrived quietly, which somehow made it even more powerful. It began in the library when Thomas Walker finally shared his findings with a small group of trusted inmates who had followed the mystery surrounding Marcus Reed from the beginning. He showed them the archived articles, the faded photographs, and the references he had spent weeks uncovering. At first, nobody spoke. They simply stared at the documents. One inmate read the same paragraph 3 times before looking up. "You are serious?" he asked. Thomas nodded. "Every piece points to the same conclusion." The room fell silent again. The quiet man they had watched reading books and sweeping hallways was not simply a former soldier. He had belonged to one of the most respected and demanding military communities in the nation. Word traveled carefully at first. Then it spread through Blackstone faster than anyone expected. Inmates discussed it during meals. They discussed it during recreation. They discussed it while waiting in line for assignments. Yet the most surprising part was Marcus himself. He did not change at all. The morning after the discovery became widely known, He woke before sunrise exactly as he always had. He completed his cleaning assignment. He greeted people politely. He read in the library. It was as though nothing had happened. Eric Dawson finally confronted him during lunch. "Everybody knows now," he said. Marcus looked up from his tray. "Knows what?" Eric laughed. "You know exactly what." Marcus smiled. "People know a few things about my past." "A few things?" Eric shook his head. "Most people spend their lives talking about accomplishments much smaller than that." Marcus folded his napkin carefully. "Accomplishments are not supposed to become your identity." The answer spread almost as quickly as the revelation itself. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Mercer found himself facing information he could no longer dismiss. A senior administrator had quietly confirmed portions of Marcus's military background after reviewing documentation connected to old records. Nothing confidential was discussed, but enough details emerged to remove any doubt. Marcus Reed had served at an exceptionally high level. Mercer sat alone in his office, staring at the report summary. For several minutes, he said nothing. He remembered every sarcastic comment, every dismissive remark, every attempt to provoke a reaction. Yet Marcus had never responded with anger, never corrected him, never mentioned his past. The realization was deeply uncomfortable. Later that week, Marcus was assigned to assist with organizing educational materials in a classroom building. As he arranged books on shelves, a correctional officer approached. Unlike Mercer, the officer seemed genuinely curious. "Why did you never tell anyone?" he asked. Marcus placed another book into position before answering. "Tell them what? About your military career." Marcus smiled faintly. "Because I came here to serve my sentence, not my resume." The officer stood quietly for a moment. Most people would have wanted recognition. Marcus looked around the classroom. Recognition is temporary. Character stays with you. Across Blackstone, respect for Marcus continued growing. Yet what impressed people most was not the revelation itself. It was the contrast. The more they learned about his past, the more remarkable his humility appeared. He never acted superior, never demanded special treatment, never used his history to gain influence. Thomas Walker understood this better than anyone. One evening, he joined Marcus during their usual walk around the recreation yard. "You know everyone sees you differently now," Thomas said. Marcus nodded. "That happens. Does it bother you?" Thomas asked. Marcus looked toward the sunset beyond the distant fencing. "Not really." "Why not?" Marcus smiled gently. "Because I know who I was before they found out, and I know who I am after." Thomas laughed softly. The answer sounded exactly like Marcus. As they continued walking, Thomas realized something important. The real surprise had never been Marcus's military background. The real surprise was discovering that a man who had achieved so much could remain so completely unaffected by whether anyone knew about it. And for Officer Daniel Mercer, that lesson was about to become impossible to ignore. The atmosphere inside Blackstone continued changing in subtle ways after the truth about Marcus Reed became known. What surprised people was not the discovery itself anymore. It was what happened afterward. Nothing about Marcus changed. He still arrived early to every assignment. He still treated officers and inmates with the same respect. He still spent evenings reading in the library and mornings walking the recreation yard. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Many people had expected someone with a background like his to carry himself differently. Instead, Marcus seemed completely uninterested in his own reputation. For Officer Daniel Mercer, that realization became increasingly difficult to escape. Every day brought another reminder. A maintenance supervisor praised Marcus for helping organize a storage area more efficiently. An educational coordinator thanked him for assisting other inmates with reading assignments. Even officers who rarely complimented prisoners spoke positively about him. Mercer found himself listening in silence. The more he learned, the more uncomfortable he became. One afternoon, while reviewing paperwork in the administration office, Mercer overheard two staff members discussing Marcus. "You would never know what that man accomplished," one of them said. "That is exactly why people respect him," the other replied. Mercer pretended not to listen, but the words stayed with him. Later that day, he encountered Marcus alone in a hallway outside the education wing. The corridor was quiet. Most inmates had already returned to their housing units. For several moments, neither man spoke. Then Mercer finally broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus looked up from the cart he was pushing. "Of course." Mercer hesitated. It was a strange feeling. For the first time since Marcus arrived, He was unsure how to begin. Why did you never tell anyone? Marcus smiled faintly. That question again. Mercer nodded. Most people would have. Marcus considered the question for several seconds. Because what I did years ago cannot change who I need to be today. Mercer stared at him. That is it. Marcus nodded. That is enough. The answer lingered long after the conversation ended. That evening, Mercer sat alone in his office thinking about everything that had happened since Marcus arrived at Blackstone. He remembered the jokes, the dismissive comments, the assumptions he had made during those first days. At the time, they had seemed harmless. Now they felt different. Not because Marcus had revealed some extraordinary past, because Marcus had never used that past to defend himself. The old man had absorbed every insult without anger, every judgment without complaint, every misunderstanding without correction. Mercer found himself wondering whether he could have done the same. The honest answer troubled him. Across the facility, Marcus spent the evening in the library helping Eric Dawson understand a history assignment. Nearby, Thomas Walker watched the interaction with a smile. You know, Thomas said, most people would enjoy the attention you are getting. Marcus chuckled softly. Attention is usually temporary. And respect? Thomas asked. Marcus closed the book and looked around the room. Respect earned through character lasts longer. Thomas nodded. He understood now. The mystery surrounding Marcus had never been about military service. It had never been about secret accomplishments. It had been about character all along. Over the following days, that lesson spread through Blackstone more effectively than any rumor ever had. Inmates who barely knew Marcus began treating one another with a little more patience. Staff members found themselves speaking about him as an example rather than a curiosity. Even Mercer noticed changes in himself. The assumptions he once made so easily no longer felt as comfortable. And late one evening, as Marcus completed another quiet walk around the recreation yard beneath the fading orange glow of sunset, Mercer watched from a distance and finally understood something that had escaped him from the beginning. The strongest person he had met inside Blackstone was not strong because of what he had accomplished decades earlier. He was strong because he no longer needed anyone else to know about it. Yet one final conversation still remained, and it would force Mercer to confront the lesson he had spent months trying not to learn. Several days after his conversation with Thomas Walker, Marcus Reed followed the same routine he had maintained since arriving at Blackstone. He completed his morning assignment, spent time in the library, and took his usual walk around the recreation yard. To anyone watching, nothing seemed different. Yet beneath the surface, something had changed. The mystery surrounding Marcus was gone. In its place stood something far more powerful. Understanding. People no longer respected him because of rumors. They respected him because they had finally seen the consistency between his past and his character. The person Marcus had been before prison matched the person he remained inside it. That realization carried weight throughout Blackstone. On a cool afternoon near the end of the month, Officer Daniel Mercer finally decided to do something he had avoided for weeks. During a quiet period between scheduled movements, he approached Marcus near the maintenance corridor where the older inmate was organizing supplies. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Mercer cleared his throat. Do you have a minute? Marcus looked up and smiled politely. Of course. Mercer nodded toward an empty bench nearby. The two men sat down. The silence lasted several seconds. For perhaps the first time in years, Mercer seemed unsure of himself. Finally, he looked directly at Marcus. I owe you an apology. Marcus remained quiet. Mercer continued. When you arrived here, I made assumptions. He looked down briefly before speaking again. A lot of assumptions. Marcus listened without interruption. I judged you before I knew anything about you. I treated you differently because of things I believed without evidence. Mercer shook his head slowly. The truth is, I was wrong. The corridor remained silent. For a moment, only the distant sounds of routine prison activity could be heard. Marcus finally spoke. Thank you for saying that. Mercer looked surprised. That is it. Marcus smiled. What more would you like? Mercer laughed quietly. Honestly, I expected a lecture. Marcus shook his head. People learn at different times. The simplicity of the response struck Mercer harder than any argument could have. You are not angry? He asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. Carrying anger for months would have hurt me more than it hurt you. Mercer stared at him. The answer explained everything. It explained why Marcus had never reacted, why he never defended himself, why he had remained calm when others judged him unfairly. The strength everyone admired had never been physical. It came from discipline, perspective, and self-control. Later that evening, word of the conversation quietly spread among staff members. Nobody treated it as dramatic. There was no confrontation, no public scene. Yet many people understood its significance. Something important had happened. A lesson had been learned. As sunset approached, Marcus joined Thomas Walker and Eric Dawson for one final walk around the recreation yard. The three men moved slowly along the familiar path Marcus had traveled countless times since arriving at Blackstone. "So," Eric said with a grin, "the mystery is officially over." Thomas laughed. "I'm not sure about that." Marcus smiled. "Neither am I." The three men shared a quiet laugh. For a few moments, nobody spoke. They simply enjoyed the cool evening air. Eventually, Thomas looked toward Marcus. "Do you know what people will remember most?" Marcus shook his head. "No," Thomas smiled. "It will not be the military service. It will not be the awards. It will not be any of the things I found in those archives." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Then what?" Thomas looked across the yard. "The fact that you never needed any of it." Marcus said nothing. He simply continued walking beneath the fading orange sky. And in that moment, Thomas realized the story had never been about hidden accomplishments. It had never been about proving anyone wrong. It had been about something much simpler. Character revealed itself over time. True confidence did not demand recognition. Real strength did not announce itself. Long before anyone learned the truth about Marcus Reed, he had already shown them exactly who he was. They simply had not been paying attention. As the evening count announcement echoed across Blackstone Correctional Facility, the three men turned toward the housing unit and walked forward together. The mystery was over. The lesson remained. And for many people inside those walls, it was a lesson they would never forget.